The desert was a hard country, the sky a merciless bruise that bled heat into the sand. He rode a shadow, a man whose name lived more often on paper than in speech, an alias scrawled beneath a photograph on a dozen wanted bills flapping on saloon walls from here to the railheads. He rode with a ridge of coins clinking beneath his coat, the fruit of last night's violence. A bank safe opened in the dark, the vault's breath frozen by the crack of a borrowed pick and the steady ringing of his own steady hand. The town he'd left behind still slept easily. The sheriff's deputies would be slow to notice what men like him did, and luck had been a faithful companion. Luck, and the discipline that comes from a long life of learning how to unmake locks, how to read a man's heartbeat from the angle of his shoulders, how to take what a crooked world refused to give. Jacob Cain, though that wasn't the name on the wanted posters, had been riding the outlaw trail for 7 years now. 7 years since the morning when he'd discovered that justice was just another commodity to be bought and sold, when the banker who'd foreclosed on his family's farm had walked free despite the forged documents Jacob had risked everything to expose. 7 years since he'd learned that sometimes a man had to become a criminal to fight crime. The irony wasn't lost on him. The very bank he'd robbed last night belonged to the same corrupt network that had destroyed his family. The coins in his coat weren't just stolen money. They were a small payment on a debt the system would never acknowledge. Every vault he cracked, every safe he opened, was another wound in the hide of men who thought their wealth made them untouchable. He'd been moving like all outlaws moved, away from witnesses, towards water and a place to wash the bank dust from his fingers, when he saw her. She wasn't a mirage. She crouched in the shade of a dead mesquite, pale against the sun, clutching a blanket to a belly that swelled in a way the world does not let men ignore. Around her lay the debris of a hurried escape. A wagon wheel shattered like a promise, a cane hat with a tear at the brim, panting horse tracks that led to nowhere. Her face was thin with something that wasn't just hunger, but a kind of shame the prairie had taught her to hide. There was blood on her hand. There were frightened shapes beneath her eyes. She looked at him like the desert had finally given up a thing to him. And because she was both danger and need all at once, his outlaw sense sharpened. The woman's dress was torn at the shoulder, revealing skin burned red by the unforgiving sun. Her shoes, once fine leather, now cracked and splitting, told the story of a woman who'd started this journey in comfort and found herself abandoned to the desert's mercy. The way she held herself, protective and defiant even in her vulnerability, spoke of strength that hadn't been broken despite whatever had brought her here. Jacob's horse sensed his tension and shifted restlessly beneath him. The animal was a bay gelding named Redemption, though Jacob sometimes wondered if the name was wishful thinking. Redemption had been with him for 3 years, stolen from a corrupt judge's stable in a moment of poetic justice. The horse was smart, loyal, and had saved Jacob's life more than once by sensing danger before human ears could detect it. He could have ridden on. He could have kept the coins warm in his vest, the noise of that heist becoming nothing but another fact in a life that had learned to ignore facts. He'd learned early that picking up a stray favor from the frontier often cost a man more than he could pay. Still, he stopped his horse. He did not dismount at once. An outlaw's instinct for self-preservation meant he watched her for a moment. The way a man watches the weather before a storm, a howl of wind moved across the plain, the only witness to a choice that would bend both their lives. In the distance, heat shimmers danced like spirits above the hardpan, and Jacob found himself thinking of his sister Sarah, who died in childbirth while he was away trying to gather evidence against the banker. Sarah had been alone too, abandoned by a husband who'd run when the money troubles started, left to face her ordeal with only an old midwife and prayers that went unanswered. "You hurt?" he asked, voice edged like a rusted knife, but with a roughness that had sheltered salvation. Before, the woman's brow furrowed. She barked a laugh that was a small, breaking thing. "Ain't you the one they're always talking about?" she said, and there was no fear in the way the sentence came out, only weary recognition. Rogue cowboy. The recognition surprised him. His reputation had spread further than he'd realized, though. He wondered what stories people told about him in this corner of the territory. Some said he was a ghost who could walk through walls and disappear into smoke. Others claimed he was a Robin Hood figure, stealing from the rich to give to the poor. The truth was less romantic. He was just a man with particular skills and a grudge against a system that protected the guilty while punishing the innocent. He did not offer a name. He tucked the coins deeper, spurred his horse closer with the caution of a great cat. He ran his gloved fingers over the leather sling. At his thigh where his tools lived, picks, small bottles for stitches, a compass he hadn't used in a while. He'd been in too many dark rooms to be surprised by the world's cruelty, and yet the sight of a woman with life beneath her ribs changed the angle of his thinking. While most men would see a liability, an additional risk, his hands remembered. Another time when hands saved. He had learned to get in and out, to take and keep silent. But he'd also learned an older, stranger thing. A man's skill could be used to sew up what the law had torn. The outlaw inside him could become the midwife for a life the law had no patience for. He reached the woman and set a small bundle beside her, a dry cloth, a bottle of whiskey he'd cracked for pain, a tin of sugar. He knelt with the unhurried care of a man who had learned how to check the faintest pulse through his palm. The woman let him, eyes shuttering against the light. She tasted of metal and dust and a desperation that could have made her bite down on anyone who tried to help. She did not ask what he wanted for aiding her. She only whispered, "The bank, my name. They called me witness. They left me in the dust. I'm with child." The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. A witness to the bank robbery, the very crime he'd committed not 12 hours ago. The irony was so sharp it cut. He'd saved a woman who could identify him, whose testimony could put a noose around his neck. Any reasonable outlaw would have remounted his horse and ridden away, leaving her to whatever fate the desert had in store. The outlaw did not flinch. He had been at the bank when the glass caught the moon and the safe surrendered its breath. Men like him saw witnesses as problems, possibilities of identification, thin threads that could lead the law to a door. This woman, however, was not a thread but a life. There was a calculation in his eyes that wasn't greed. He thought of the sheriff, sleeves too clean from his office's ledger and hands too soft for a world that bled dirty, handing a paper over to the richest account holder and sweeping the poor under the rug. He thought of why a man like him had become a shadow, because a crooked law sometimes invited only crooked remedies. In a place where a badge could be bought and the courts could be rented, an outlaw's hands had value beyond coin. He lifted her with both arms, careful as if she were glass. Her weight told him she had not much time before whatever danger had found her completely. He urged his horse into a trot, the sun cutting off their shadows in a stark slash of heat. Behind them, on the hard road, the faintest imprint of several horses' hooves marked a line of pursuit. It might have been another gang hoping to reclaim a cut of gold. It might have been the sheriff and his deputies' silk-laced authority, swinging collars of justice that suited only those who could afford them. "What's your name?" he asked as they rode, his voice pitched low to avoid carrying on the wind. "Clara," she whispered back. "Clara Wittman. And you're Jacob Cain, though that's not what they call you on the posters." The fact that she knew his real name sent a chill down his spine. Very few people knew that Jacob Cain and the Desert Ghost were the same man. He'd been careful to keep his past buried, to ensure that his outlaw identity couldn't be traced back to the farm boy who'd believed in justice and fair play. Clara's story emerged slowly as they rode. She was a school teacher in Millbrook, a small, town 50 miles east, where her husband had been the bank manager. Thomas Wittman had been an honest man in a dishonest business, and his honesty had gotten him killed when he discovered that his own bank was being used to launder money from cattle rustling and land fraud. "They made it look like an accident," Clara said, her voice hollow with remembered grief. "A fall down the stairs," they said. But Thomas was careful, methodical. He'd never fallen down anything in his life. After her husband's death, Clara had tried to continue his investigation, but being a woman in a man's world had made her efforts nearly impossible. When she'd finally gathered enough evidence to prove the bank's corruption, she'd been branded as a hysterical widow and threatened with commitment to an asylum if she didn't stop making wild accusations. There was a fork before him now. Ride on and keep his freedom, or sink his name deeper into the mud by saving a life 1,000 warrants away. For the first time in a long while, the outlaw's moral compass pointed somewhere besides the nearest coin. He spoke without pretense. "You. Keep quiet, you do what I say, we make it past noon." The woman's laugh was a small, uncertain thing. "You'll get yourself dead. Been dead before," Jacob replied with grim humor. Didn't much care for it. He looked back once, toward the road where the hoofprints were still young. Something in his chest tightened like the jury rope of an old trade. He thought of the newborn's small hands, the way a child might make a man out of him that no bounty poster could erase. He made his choice then. He guided the horse off the road into the scrub that would swallow a man whole for a time and headed toward a place known only to his shadowed life. They reached his hideout as the sun sank into a long bruise on the horizon. An old sheep herder's shack hunkered between two outcroppings of rock, more an idea than a shelter, with a lean-to that could not be trusted in a storm. He tethered the horse in a corral built of spare lumber and a few lengths of rusted rail. The shack smelled of gun oil, tobacco, and a man's solitude. The hideout had been Jacob's home for 2 years, gradually improved with supplies stolen or bought in distant towns where his face wasn't known. The walls were adobe brick reinforced with stones, thick enough to stop most bullets. The single window was positioned to give a clear view of the approach while remaining invisible to anyone riding the main trail. He moved like someone who had rehearsed entry into hostile places. His hands were steady as he eased the woman down from his arms and into the dimness. He lit a lamp with the quickness of someone familiar with shadows, then began his work like a man performing a ritual. Her name was Clara, though she called herself by the childhood name her mother had given her. Something soft that kept her from being reduced to the phrase, the witness. She was small but fierce in the way a fern is fierce when it keeps growing in a crack in the stone. Her hands had been busy. There were stitches on her hem, a faint callus on her thumb that betrayed a life of laundry and making do. She was not helpless. She had run because she had to. She had survived because she could. The child beneath her ribs had been the only easy thing in a world that had turned cruel. He examined her wounds with the same unforgiving thoroughness that had put him into this life. He had sewn up meneless cuts with liquor and braided wire. He had closed doors and the mouths that stood at them. He worked with a steadiness that surprised him. He cleaned and bandaged, humming a low, ugly tune he'd learned in a cell once, a song about the cold, honest world. She watched him with a guarded curiosity, as if measuring whether his hands could be trusted not to fold like a paper trap. The ease of his criminal past, the immediacy and usefulness of muscle memory, became the architecture of rescue. He picked the lock on the shack's weathered chest and brought out a small tin of whiskey he reserved for true emergencies. He warmed the bottle between his hands and offered it to her like a peace treaty. "What made you stop?" she asked as the night pressed close and the lamp's flame made a small, private arena. The question was not a demand, but a careful curiosity. He looked at her and felt a memory unspool. a time when he'd been too young to know the difference between right and necessity, when his hands had first learned to pick a lock for the hunger of a younger brother. "Because you were bleeding," he said. "Because you were with a child. Because the world's already stolen enough." Outside, the earth murmured with the night, and the road took notice. Somewhere on that road, hoofbeats continued to whisper that their owners were not done with the world. He felt the hollowness that often follows lawless men when they try to fold themselves into kindness, like a winter sweater worn under armor. A noise at the door, a scrape of something intended to test the limits of their hiding, made them both turn. The outlaw's hand went to the pistol at his hip, not in reflex but in ritual. Clara, for all her frailty, slid sideways to put her back against his, offering something like presence more than protection. "Well, well," came a voice from outside, rich with mock friendliness. "Jacob Cain, the famous desert ghost. We've been looking for you for quite some time." Tobias Reeves had a voice like honey poured over broken glass, smooth on the surface, but deadly underneath. Jacob had heard stories about Reeves for years before they'd finally crossed paths. The man was a killer who turned outlawry into an art form, leaving a trail of bodies across 3 territories while somehow avoiding serious pursuit by the law. "Reeves," Jacob called back, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Come to talk business, or are you just passing through?" A laugh answered him, cold and amused. "Oh, we're here on business, all right. See, you've been operating in our territory without permission. That's bad for business, Cain. Bad for reputation." The standoff that followed was tense and deadly. Reeves had come with enough men to surround the cabin, but Jacob knew this country better than anyone. When the shooting started, he was ready. Using his knowledge of the terrain and a series of carefully prepared surprises, Jacob managed to turn the tables on his attackers. The fight was brief but vicious, ending with Reeves wounded and his gang scattered to the winds. But victory came at a cost. Clara had gone into labor during the battle, brought on by the stress and trauma of the night. With no doctor for 50 miles, and enemies still lurking in the darkness, Jacob found himself playing midwife to a woman who'd already saved his soul simply by trusting him to save her life. The child was born as dawn broke over the desert, a healthy daughter who announced her arrival with a cry that seemed to chase away the last shadows of the night. Clara held her close, tears streaming down her face as she whispered words of love and protection. "What will you call her?" Jacob asked, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and emotion. "Hope," Clara replied without hesitation. "Because that's what you gave me when I thought there was none left in the world." The weeks that followed were among the strangest of Jacob's outlaw career. He found himself playing protector and provider to a woman and child who had no one else in the world to turn to. It was a role he'd never imagined for himself, but one that felt more natural than any badge he'd ever worn. Clara proved to be a remarkable woman, strong and resourceful despite everything she'd been through. She helped Jacob organize his hideout, turning the rough shelter into something approaching a home. More importantly, she helped him organize his thoughts, encouraging him to see his skills not as tools for revenge, but as weapons in a larger war against corruption and injustice. "You could do so much more than just rob banks," she told him one evening as they watched baby Hope sleep. "You could expose the people behind the corruption, bring down entire networks of criminals masquerading as respectable businessmen." The idea intrigued Jacob. He'd always focused on immediate targets, banks, corrupt officials, specific acts of injustice. But Clara was talking about something bigger, more systematic. She was talking about using his skills to dismantle the entire corrupt system that had destroyed both their lives. Together, they began planning a campaign that would expose the network of corruption centered around the banker Oliver Cromstead and Sheriff Marcus Henley. Using Clara's knowledge of her husband's investigation and Jacob's skills at gathering intelligence, they slowly assembled a case that would bring down dozens of corrupt officials. The work was dangerous and slow, requiring careful planning and precise execution. They had to gather evidence without being detected, build alliances with honest people who could help them, and stay one step ahead of enemies who would kill them without hesitation if they were discovered. But gradually, their efforts began to bear fruit. Documents were obtained, witnesses were protected, and evidence was compiled. Jacob's reputation as the desert ghost evolved from that of a simple outlaw to something more complex. A figure who fought corruption wherever he found it, using illegal means to serve the cause of justice. Word of their work spread through the underground networks of honest people who'd been crushed by the corrupt system. Families who'd lost their land to forge documents, workers who'd been cheated of their wages, women who'd been abused by powerful men, all began to see Jacob and Clara as symbols of hope in a world that had offered them none. The transformation wasn't easy for Jacob. He'd spent 7 years hardening his heart against sentiment and compassion, learning to think only of survival and revenge. Now he found himself caring about people again, feeling responsible for their welfare, willing to risk everything to protect them. The final confrontation came sooner than expected. Reeves, recovered from his wounds and nursing a grudge, had aligned himself with Cromstead and Henley. Together, they represented everything Jacob had been fighting against: corruption, violence, and the abuse of power for personal gain. The showdown took place in the town of Silver Creek, where Jacob and Clara had gone to deliver their evidence to Federal Marshal Samuel Hart. Hart was one of the few completely honest lawmen in the territory, a man whose reputation for integrity made him the perfect person to handle their explosive revelations. But Reeves and his allies had been waiting for them. The streets of Silver Creek became a battleground as Jacob fought to protect Clara and Hope while ensuring that the evidence reached Marshal Hart safely. The battle raged through the night, with Jacob using every skill he'd learned as an outlaw to outmaneuver and outfight his enemies. Clara proved herself a formidable ally, using her intelligence and courage to help coordinate their defense and protect the evidence that could bring down the entire corrupt network. When dawn finally broke, the corrupt alliance was shattered. Reeves was dead, killed in a final gunfight with Jacob in the main street of Silver Creek. Cromstead and Henley were in custody, facing federal charges that would put them away for the rest of their lives. Most importantly, the evidence was safe and in the hands of authorities who could act on it. The trials that followed became a sensation, drawing attention from newspapers across the country. The scope of the corruption was staggering. Dozens of officials, hundreds of crimes, thousands of victims. But justice finally prevailed, with convictions and sentences that sent a clear message that the old system of corruption and abuse was coming to an end. Jacob's own legal situation was complex. He was still wanted for numerous crimes, but his cooperation in exposing the corruption network had earned him powerful allies. Federal authorities were willing to offer him a deal, a full pardon in exchange for his testimony and a promise to leave the outlaw life behind. The offer was tempting, but Jacob knew that accepting it would mean giving up the work that had become his calling. He'd found purpose in fighting corruption, meaning in protecting the innocent, and a family in Clara and Hope. The idea of returning to a normal life seemed almost impossible after everything they'd been through together. In the end, it was Clara who helped him make the decision. "You don't have to choose between being legal and being good," she told him. "You can find ways to fight for justice without being outside the law." Jacob accepted the pardon and began a new life as a legitimate citizen, but he didn't abandon his mission to fight corruption and protect the innocent. Instead, he found legal ways to use his skills. working as a private investigator and consultant for people who needed help navigating a system that was still far from perfect. Clara returned to teaching, but she also became an advocate for victims of corruption and abuse. Her experience with the legal system's failures made her a powerful voice for reform, and she worked tirelessly to ensure that other families wouldn't suffer the way hers had. Hope grew up in a household where justice and compassion were the highest. Her values, where helping others was considered the most important work anyone could do. She learned early that her parents were different from other families, that they carried scars from battles most people never had to fight, but that those scars had made them stronger and more committed to making the world a better place. As the years passed, Jacob's legend evolved. He was no longer seen as just an outlaw or even a reformed criminal. He became a symbol of redemption, proof that people could change, that the past didn't have to define the future, that even the most broken among us could become forces for good in the world. The work continued case by case, family by family, injustice by injustice. Jacob and Clara developed a network of allies across the territory, people who shared their commitment to justice and were willing to help when the situation required it. They never called themselves vigilantes or claimed to be above the law. Instead, they positioned themselves as consultants who helped people navigate complex legal situations and ensured that evidence reached the right authorities. Their daughter Hope proved to be a natural at the work, combining her father's technical skills with her mother's organizational abilities and adding her own innovations. She had a talent for gathering information from sources that adults couldn't access, and her youth made her invisible in situations where her parents would attract attention. The family business, though they never officially called it that, continued to grow and evolve. They adapted to changing times, always finding ways to help when the system failed, always working to make the system work better for everyone. Hope married a federal marshal named David Chen, a man who shared the family's commitment to justice and understood the sometimes unconventional methods required to achieve it. Their children grew up hearing stories of their grandfather, the reformed outlaw, and their grandmother, the teacher who'd changed the world one student at a time. Years passed, and the territory continued to change. Statehood brought new laws and better enforcement, but it also brought new forms of corruption and new challenges for people trying to live honest lives. The Cain family adapted to these changes, always finding ways to help when the system failed. Jacob's hair turned gray, then white, but his hands remained steady and his commitment to justice never wavered. Clara became a grandmother, then a great-grandmother, watching new generations grow up in a world that was slowly becoming more fair and just. The legend of the desert ghost faded into history, replaced by new stories about the Cain family and their quiet war against corruption. Some people knew the truth about Jacob's past, but most saw only a respected locksmith and his family, pillars of the community who could always be counted on to help when help was needed. One spring morning, as Jacob was working in his shop, a young man arrived with a story that sounded achingly familiar. His name was Tommy Rodriguez, and he claimed that his family's ranch was being stolen through forged documents and corrupted court proceedings. The local sheriff was taking bribes, the judge was in someone's pocket, and honest citizens had nowhere to turn for help. I heard you might understand, Tommy said carefully, that you might know something about fighting corruption when the law won't help. Jacob studied the young man carefully, seeing something of his younger self in the desperate hope and barely contained anger. The investigation that followed confirmed Tommy's worst fears. The ranch was being stolen through a complex scheme, involving forged deeds, bribed officials, and intimidated witnesses, working together with Clara and Hope. Jacob developed a plan that was more sophisticated than anything he'd attempted in his outlaw days. Instead of simply stealing money or exposing corruption, they engineered a comprehensive campaign to restore the stolen property and ensure that the criminals faced consequences for their actions. The success of the Rodriguez case led to others. Word spread that the Cain family could help when the legal system failed, that they had ways of ensuring justice prevailed even in the most corrupted circumstances. They developed a system for evaluating cases, providing help when traditional avenues had been exhausted, and ensuring that evidence reached the right authorities. Jacob's old skills translated perfectly to this new calling. Lockpicking became document recovery, safe-cracking became evidence gathering. His knowledge of criminal behavior helped him anticipate and counter the schemes of corrupt officials. As Jacob entered his 70s, he began to slow down physically, but his mind remained sharp and his commitment to justice never wavered. He spent his final years writing memoirs and teaching others the skills they would need to continue the work he'd started. The techniques he taught weren't just about picking locks or cracking safes. They were about seeing through deception, gathering evidence, building cases, and organizing people to fight for what was right. He taught patience, persistence, and the importance of working within the law whenever possible. The goal isn't to be an outlaw, he told his students. The goal is to make outlaws unnecessary. Clara passed away peacefully in her sleep on a winter morning in 1903, surrounded by the family she'd helped create and the community she'd helped protect. Jacob grieved deeply for the woman who'd been his partner in every sense of the word, but he found comfort in knowing that their work would continue through Hope and her children. Jacob himself lived until 1907, long enough to see the automobile replace the horse, the telephone connect distant communities, and the airplane promise to shrink the world even further. But the most important changes he witnessed were in the hearts and minds of people who'd learned that they had the power to fight injustice and create positive change. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he'd touched, families whose ranches he'd saved, children whose educations Clara had provided, officials whose corruption he'd exposed, and countless ordinary citizens who'd learned from his example that one person really could make a difference. The eulogy was delivered by Hope, now a respected community leader in her own right. She spoke about her father's journey from outlaw to hero, from bitterness to hope, from solitude to family. He taught us that the law is important, she said, but justice is essential, that sometimes good people have to be willing to risk everything to protect those who can't protect themselves, that the fight for what's right never ends, but it's always worth fighting. As Jacob was laid to rest beside Clara in the cemetery overlooking Silver Creek, the desert wind carried the sound of church bells and children's laughter, the sounds of a community that had learned to believe in justice and hope. The marker on his grave was simple. Jacob Cain, 1845-1907, locksmith father, fighter for justice. But those who knew his story understood that the real memorial was the legacy of integrity and courage he'd left behind. The sun has set on Jacob Cain's remarkable journey from outlaw to hero. But his legacy lives on in every person who chooses. Courage over comfort, justice over profit, and hope over despair. His story reminds us that redemption is always possible, that even the most broken among us can become forces for good in the world. If this tale of transformation, sacrifice, and ultimate triumph touched something in your heart, show your appreciation by hitting that like button. Share this story with others who believe that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they stand up for what's right. And subscribe to our channel to join a community that celebrates the power of stories to inspire, challenge, and transform. Because, like the fight for justice itself, great stories are meant to be shared. They're meant to remind us that heroes aren't born. They're made through the choices they make when faced with impossible odds. They're meant to inspire us to be better than we are, to fight harder than we thought we could, and to never give up hope that tomorrow can be better than today. Until our next story unfolds, remember, sometimes the greatest treasure isn't the gold you steal from a bank vault, but the life you choose to save along the way. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the gun on your hip, but the courage beating in your heart. And sometimes the difference between an outlaw and a hero is simply deciding that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Keep fighting the good fight, and we'll see you in the next story.